In 1902, in a necropolis of rock-cut caves called Newerat, 265 kilometers south of Cairo, a pot burial was discovered which was more than 4,500 years old. The remains were so well preserved, scientists extracted a full sequencing of his DNA. It shows a history of the people of North Africa and Egypt going back 35,000 years. His bones showed signs of physical labor, consistent with pottery production, wear in his neck, and from his arms being extended in front of him, and his right foot was misshapen perhaps from the spinning of the potter's wheel. With that, and being he was buried in a pot, he is assumed to have been a potter. His DNA is the oldest ancient Egyptian, genetically sequenced, its importance coming from the early dynasties, and deep in the Nile being somewhat more isolated from migrations, helps us understand who the first Egyptians were. The Egyptians were a product of different migrations over millennia. By using other samples through time over a wide range of North Africa, and using autosomal genetic clustering against a range of samples and haplogroups, we can create an understanding of migrations over time. The newest samples were published in Nature in 2025 and were called 4,500-year-old ancient Egyptian DNA full sequencing from teeth. This video will dive into the genetic evidence of North Africa and Egypt using all known ancient samples and seeing how they do or don't relate with each other. What kind of genetic continuity did the ancients have with each other? And with populations of today, his DNA sampled closest to the Taforalt and Levantine samples. Clustering charts show you where a sample sits in relation to other samples, and autosomal graphs show the basic genetic makeup. When lined up side by side, you can see how the genetic makeup shifts with migrations and conquest over time. The mtDNA coming from his maternal line was from a very early out of Africa group that settled somewhere around the Levant, which is called mtDNAN. By tracing the subgroup, we see that they came into Egypt about 15,000 years ago. The first North African and out of Africa groups split off from the rest of the African population 75,000 years ago, and their mtDNA was L3. They traveled north and left Africa about 65 to 70,000 years ago. They then spread all around the world. A group from N continued north into Eurasia, until they then traveled south and entered Egypt around 35,000 years ago, bringing with them haplogroups U6 and M1. They continued all the way to Morocco, where they are known in the 15,000-year-old Taforalt samples, which also showed that 18,000 years ago another group entered Egypt from the Levant, from their Y chromosome being E1B1B, where it covered all of North Africa all the way to Morocco. The Taforalt people in Morocco also carried some Northeast African Maghrebi mtDNA L3, a population which no longer exists today and whose only genetic survivors are the Berber people who carry up to 8% in my estimates. The Taforalt were 63% Basal-Eurasian and Levantine and 37% Maghrebi L3. The 4,500-year-old sample Newerat was said to be 76% North African and 24% Fertile Crescent. The distinction lies in the Fertile Crescent genetic contribution being only 500 years prior to himself. What constitutes the 76% North African is the homogenized mix of migrations with more time to blend. I got time periods by tracing the haplogroups, subclad, and other migratorily associated haplogroups. Just think of the haplogroup category as a tribal name. Slight differences of the subclads are how the relation differed by region and time. His paternal ancestry, Y chromosome, was E1, B, 1B, 1B, 2B, which was similar to two Mesolithic Natufian samples from Israel, who are the oldest E1B1 samples to date, and may have been the first to spread cereal farming. His E1B1 paternal line expanded throughout the Levant about 12,000 years ago and entered Egypt 6 to 8,000 years ago, likely with the Neolithic Anatolian farmer migrations that populated the Near East, North Africa, and Europe. Caucasus tribes also may have entered with the farmers 7,000 years ago, bringing R1 BV88 and R1B M269, the later being the same that would later enter Europe with the Proto-Indo-Europeans from the South Eurasian steppe, roughly South Ukraine today. Newerat's mother's mtDNA line was I/N, a early out-of-Africa group that entered into Egypt 10 to 15,000 years ago from the southern Levant. Two samples in the ancient Green Sahara were from an isolated group with an older but similar N maternal haplogroup. They were both female, so we couldn't get there. Paternal Y haplogroup. In the first chart, we see where Newerat clusters. He sits within what's labeled as West Asia, which is the Near East. Next closest is the Caucasus and Europe, probably because Caucasus tribes came down into Anatolia, and because Egypt and Europe share a migratory history from the Anatolians. He's the furthest away from East Asian and Sub-Saharan African. Chart B shows his relation with ancient and modern populations. It's interesting to see the movement of the ancient mixes and how migratory blending has moved modern populations from ancestral ones, like how the Moroccan sample is green because of its Paleolithic African roots, and a triangle to represent its Levantine roots, landing them proportionally where their mix rests. This cluster map shows how all these groups relate, concluding his affinity to ancient and modern Levantines. Chart A shows the different admixtures of the ancient samples. If each mixture was to be broken down again, it would be clear to see how they all show related admixtures, just at different amounts. Chart B shows by how much Newerat differs from the ancient Moroccan samples, mostly just by differences of the same mixes. Figure A shows the proportions of the first intermediate period, 65% Levantine and 35% ancient Moroccan. Ancient Moroccan is 32% of an early basal out of Africa branch, and 68% Paleolithic, Levantine, and Eurasian from very ancient lineages. This chart shows the Egyptian composition from the early dynasties to modern times using DNA analysis of hundreds of mummies throughout the time periods, using the genetic mix of what composes ancient Moroccan and Newerat's genome separately from later migratory admixes. In this chart, we see the migrations of peoples into Egypt from the Caucasus, Levant, and other places separately from Newerat and the ancient Moroccan samples, even though they both also had Levantine and other out-of-African ancestry themselves. This is a map of the ancient sample locations. Chart D is another way to look at where Newerat sits to other samples of Egypt's cultural and genetic transitional history. By studying ancient samples, we get an idea of the movements of ancient man, the ideas and cultural influences they brought with them, and how they were shared. The genomic history reflects migrations, conquests, and emergence. The hows and whys are a story of their own. I hope I was able to thoroughly break down Newerat's ancestry in a way that wasn't too confusing or repetitive, using scientific labels so you have a reference to research it if you wanted. Part 2 is a deep dive into all the ancient Egyptian samples we have to date to see how Egyptians were the same or not the same, and the different genomic legacies of the everyday people and the pharaohs themselves, also with a look at the ancient Nubians and how their cultural influences related to the Egyptian first dynasties and abroad. Who were they and where did they come from?